So one of the people that I have had the absolute pleasure of working with over the last few weeks is going to be our next speaker, Claire Wilgar, and she's going to be talking about CSS for the modern web. So please give her a massive round of applause.
Everyone hear me? Trying to use this with it. Okay, good. I'm still gonna have to walk back and forward because my slides are only over here. I can't use a fancy clicker because I'm on slide presence. But yes, hi. As Nikita already introduced me, I'm Claire. I work for Bazaarvoice. I also, like you might see me around some of the meetups, I do Belfast JS, I do Women in Tech Lean in Belfast, and I do this. So yeah, I'm pretty sure most of you have met at some event or other at some point. I did this last year as well. So I'm just going to talk about CSS because I feel like a lot of people, even people that work in web, they kind of go, oh, not CSS, no, don't make me do CSS. I don't like it, it's scary, it's confusing, and yeah, I have no idea what to do. Which, to be fair, even though it's my job, I also often feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. And I also feel like sometimes I just keep pasting in different things until one of them works, and then I'm like, yeah, that looks what I thought it would look like. We'll move on. But yeah, so to give like, for those of you that aren't really familiar with CSS to begin with, or it's not part of your job description or your interests, in case someone just does it for fun. Cascading style sheets is what CSS stands for. And it's really a bunch of rules to set out the presentation of your web page. So you've got your HTML, which is your content, you've got your JavaScript, which is your functionality, and then you've got your CSS, which just sets out how everything looks, makes it pretty, makes it themed, whatever you need. CSS is made up of rules, which are built up from a selector, which decides what the rule applies to, and then the properties, which are what the rules do. Specificity is, I'm actually really impressed that I said that right first time, is sort of the most sort of important thing in CSS. Like it controls everything else. And the other important thing about CSS that I think a lot of people, it's what trips them up, is that it starts at the top and works the way down. So if you just set a rule at the top, and then you set it again later on, the bottom one will always apply. So it's really easy to go in and start changing something and wonder why it's not changing, because actually you're changing it again somewhere lower down. So as a small example, this is a shape. So if there was any shape in general on the screen, it would be green, or it would be blue. But because the second rule is more specific, of being square, that's the one that applies. So it sets the background color to green. It's really simple, it's not a complicated example. And then to highlight the second point, if I have another rule right underneath it that says background color to pink, that overrides that immediately. And that could be, like those two rules don't have to be in the same thing, like one line after each other in the file. They could be totally separate, they could be in different files completely. But the one that comes afterwards into your page is always going to be the one that overrides the first one and sets the final thing, which can make things a bit confusing. So what I'm going to do, because I'm not going to do an introduction to all of CSS ever, because people that know it will be really bored and people that don't know it will be even more bored. I'm just going to talk through, as I said for my title, some modern CSS things, some things that people don't know about or just haven't really got a chance to play with, and how they can make things a lot easier compared to certainly how we used to have to do things when we were building GeoCities websites and using link marquees and all the rest of it. So I'm going to start with layouts, two things in particular, which is Flexbox and CSS Grid. First one is Flexbox. So this is sort of reasonably modern, and it's just a way of really setting out a layout within a particular box. So sort of hard maybe to see from my examples, but the way that this would work is like it's one-dimensional. So you either set, you tell it everything should flow in a row or everything should flow in a column, which is what you can see the difference between those two things there. And it's content based, so basically you would say, okay, here's the content for these three, for the three yellow boxes, this is what should go in them, this is what size they should be, and it'll work out all the spacing around those, which is really nice if you're doing a layout, because you don't have to be like, okay, I need exactly 5 pixels between that and that every time. If you have 4 things in a row, you don't have to sit and mathematically work out at every resolution how much spacing you need to give it. It'll just figure it out. It just goes, okay, this is how much content I have, this is how much space I have, so I can tell what to put in these spaces in between. And it also does really nice things, like it's really good for responsive layouts. You know, you can tell it to wrap around. So, like with this example, I have it, you know, sort of sideways and then down the ways if it's long. But even the sort of bottom one, which is 3 squares in a row, if I make my page thinner, it'll just start wrapping the third one along. If there's no room, we'll just fall onto the line underneath, which is really nice and really helps us get away from the old, you know, mobile.website.com thing where you had to have a whole different layout and all the rest of it. You can really make something nice and responsive, something that sort of flows sensibly and behaves based on what's in your website, rather than a bunch of like really specific rules. And this is just an example. So Instagram, their webpage is mostly their layout is Flexbox. So you can sort of see the yellow and the purple on that. If it's maybe hard to tell, is some of the padding. And then whenever you bring it in, it loses a lot of the padding around the edges. But also, as you can see, it's maybe hard to see in the blue. It just decreases the spacing between the images. That's my Instagram, so don't judge the pictures. Mostly just my nails. So it just decreases them automatically. So you know you don't have to set, if the website's this size, make this much spacing. Yeah. And then the other one is CSS grid. So this is even newer than Flexbox, and it sort of sometimes feels a bit like magic. It's a bit weird. But it's 2-dimensional. So basically it sort of does what it says on the tin, in that you set out a grid. You say how many rows you want, how many columns you want, and then you sort of fit things in that way. So it's layout first. So like you would say, okay, I need to go 5 across and 4 down, and then you know it'll sort of fill things in the right positions. You can sort of see there. So that's the same layout, exactly the same code, but just in a different sized window in the images there. So it'll just figure things out, which again is really nice for mobile, for responsiveness, for the fact that nowadays, you know, people could be using like your website on 20, 30 different types of device rather than just an 800 by 600 CRT monitor where everything looks the same to everybody. This is Slack.com. This is an example of somewhere that uses grid. So you can see the sort of purple lines, which is just that, like, that's not on the website. That's sort of a grid, CSS grid inspector, and it just sort of sets out the rules where all the items fit into it. Now that's it with just a slightly smaller window, so it was on like an iPad. And they've got the exact same content in there, but the CSS grid rules allow it to sort of wrap around and flow into the right spaces at different breakpoints. You can see the sort of email address section moves from the side to underneath, so they would just set different rules for that to be in a different row on a different size. So I hope that makes sense, sort of. And the next thing, which sort of flows on from that, is queries. So you can use queries to find out different things about the web page that your content is going to be on, and use these to change what rules you apply. Media types query. So this is sort of the bare bones initial thing. You can check where your content is. So is it going to be printed out? Is it going to be on a screen? Is it going to be on a screen reader? Or is it going to be in all? Because you want to maybe apply different things, and there are different rules that you can apply. The example I've given there is on a screen, I might have like a really fancy rainbowy gradient behind my header, which looks really shiny, and it's like white text and this lovely thing. But like, I don't hate anyone enough to make them print out a big rainbow gradient with white text in the middle, and like wait 20 minutes for that to come through the printer. So all I would do is say, okay, if I'm on like print, if this is being printed out, I apply a different rule, and the background isn't there anymore. And then you just have the text, and you're not destroying everyone's ink and printers and making them go through all that. There's also, as I said, so the speech media type would be for screen readers, so there's some specific rules you can apply in those cases. You can tell it like, oh, this section is to be read as initials rather than words for things that we said like CSS. I don't want it to try and pronounce that as a word. I want to say these are letters, just read it out that way. You can tell it to change the volume. A lot of these things you shouldn't really do unless you absolutely need to. For accessibility reasons, you don't want to mess about with someone's screen reader because most people have them set up to be a certain way of what they need. But sometimes, like with initials or brand names or things like that, it's useful. But you can only apply those rules to the sort of content that's coming through a speech reader. So it's just useful to be able to, you know, apply those there and not have them in the middle of everything else, because it can just confuse things. Okay, and another, this is probably the most common sort of query that a lot of people use, which is at media. So it can just tell you some things about the media that your content is on. So the most common one there is the one I've got in the example, which is screen size. This is the one that almost everyone, if they've done some sort of responsive website, has used to say, okay, if it's on a mobile size, make it look like this. If it's on desktop, make it look like this. If it's on tablet, like this. And it is really useful because, like, fair enough, we do have things like CSS grid, but those aren't, they won't solve every problem every time. And even before we had that, we had media queries. So there's a lot of other things you can check. I've mentioned some things like height, orientation, but definitely the most common are the minimum max sort of screen sizes. And the important thing with these is that you should start, like, whenever you're writing, you should write some sort of base CSS that you want to apply everywhere, and then you build on that. So, like, mobile first is the sort of recommended pattern now. So you write all your CSS by default for mobile, and then you add the media queries and you say, okay, you don't need to put everything in there again. You put in the things that are going to change. So you put in everything at the start, you know, like maybe your background color, your fonts, whatever else, and then you say, okay, but if I'm on a smaller screen, I want this. If I'm on a bigger screen, I want this. So it just lets you be specific because, as we said, specificity is really important, and the last thing you want is to make users pull down like piles and piles and piles of CSS because you have to be really specific. If you can just only add the stuff that you really need. And then the last one of the queries I'm going to talk about is at supports, which is, again, another thing that feels kind of like suspicious shiny magic. Because basically what you can do is you say, I want to use this thing, but it's really new and fancy. But I can just check if I'm allowed to use it, and if I'm not, I just do something else. So not every browser supports very well yet, but if it does, it's really handy. Like CSS grid, not all browsers will support that, so I can say, okay, if someone's using like Opera Mini on their phone, then CSS grid won't work, so I can check, and then rather than just leaving them with a mess of stuff, they will still get something, and I still have some CSS that they can use, rather than the whole thing getting confused and falling over because those rules don't apply and I've just assumed that they're there. And it just sort of helps keep things separated that way. Okay, measurements of values. This one's terrible. I can't do art, so it's kind of a ruler. Measurement units. So there's a lot of different ways that you can measure things when you're building for the web. I mean, you could put things in centimeters if you really want to. I'm not sure why that would be useful because everyone's using a different screen size and a different resolution anyway, and it's just going to make things more confusing. So these are some of the more common ones. Pixels, probably the one that we all sort of know and love or hate, which is precise to the pixels on the screen of the person you're using. And now we have ems and rems. So ems would be, this sort of comes from typography terms, but these would come equivalent to the font size. So like 1 em would be the size of whatever your base font size is. If it's 16 pixels, 1 em is 16 pixels tall. Rem is a relative version of that, so it's kind of hard to tell in my diagram, but basically the green ones are ems and the blue ones underneath that are rems. In this they're the same size because I've set the typography in both cases to be 10. But the relative version means it's relative to the parent box rather than the whole page. That's really the only difference there. So I could set different font sizes at different places on my screen and everything would scale up. Whereas with ems, everything would be relevant to the font size at the very top level, and I would just have to work things out. And then the sort of newest, shiniest one that's quite nice, but can, as you can see in my diagram, can lead it to be really messy, is viewport height and width. So these are basically like a sort of a percentage. So you would say, okay, if I want something to be 50% of the width of my screen at all times, then I put it at 50 BW, which is viewport width. Which is really, really nice, as I said before, when it comes to stuff like responsiveness, but like can lead to really broken things because you can't predict it. Like those are the same boxes in both of those squares, but in one of them I've just changed the size of the window. So, you know, viewport height and width won't care about the containers it's in or anything, it only cares about the size of the screen that you're looking at. So it can be really helpful, but it can be really messy, because if someone has a weird sort of ratio of their device, everything might get all over the place. But it's very useful. And then CSS calc coming into measurements again. So this is also sort of new and also quite shiny. What I've done in this is sort of making me scroll a bit. But it's just a bracket, there's nothing else underneath that, so don't worry. So the example I've given here is for calculating, like if you wanted to have something in the center of your page. So beforehand you would have had to work out, if you didn't have CSS calc, that, okay, I'm just going to pick a number for the side of each margin, and at every sort of size of screen I'll set a different size, and the article will just fill the rest. Whereas now I can say, okay, I want my article to always be, you know, say in this example it's 10 rems away from 100. So that means there's always going to be 10 rems of padding around my article, and the article will stretch to be the rest. So like 5 on each side, because I put margin 0 order there, it would just sit in the middle. And this is a fairly simple example, but it actually becomes really nice when you're doing things with SVGs or sort of weird shapes or strange layouts. And even just things like button positioning, because it just helps you make things a bit more specific without having to sit down and sort of work out mathematically and then have to keep changing that. It'll just work it out on the fly for you. So like if your screen size changes, that, you know, the sizing changes. And so as part of CSS Grid, which I was talking about earlier, I'm massively going over time, sorry, I'm very slow. We have, this is called fractions. So this is the same example 3 times, but all I've done is saying that how many fractions of the box one of the pink boxes can take up. And I'm just putting this in to show you that it'll just sort of magically works, but it only works within CSS Grid at the minute. But basically, if it's 1/4, they'll all fill out evenly. If they're allowed to take up 1/3 of the screen, the next one will wrap. If they're allowed to take 1/5 of the screen, then there's spacing at the end. It's just sort of a nice magical way to sort of set things out evenly. Okay, pseudo-class, I'm going to go through these really quickly because it's not too, hopefully not sort of too complicated if I go quickly, but I don't want to massively run over my time. So pseudo-classes are basically just a way to be a little more specific again, without having to add more and more classes onto everything, and in a way that's sort of a bit more reactive to the content. So the examples there I have are if you have focus on an item or something's checked, then you can add specific classes without having to use like piles of JavaScript to detect things and add and take away classes. And then the lower examples are, I think, like nth child and nth type. So in this case, the examples I've done are, the first one is the nth child being 2n. So every second one is green. They're pink by default, but every second one is green. The second version of that is nth of type. So it's every second square in that example would be green. So even though it's the third shape along, it's the second square. So it's just a bit of a way to be a little bit more specific without having to add a bunch of classes or sort of count things out in JavaScript. And pseudo elements. So this is probably kind of a bit of a mess if I don't take too much time to explain it, but this is basically just a way to sort of add secret things in, if that makes sense. Like you don't have to declare them in your HTML, but you can add them in just in CSS. Like I really recommend that you be very careful what you do this with, because again, for accessibility reasons, like if you're adding a little icon because you have a word there that they can already understand or make sense, that's fine, but don't use this and this alone to like mean stuff if you can at all avoid it. But I've just shown there's examples of the ways that you can have things where it checks again the status of the element and then can add or take things away based on that. Variables are magic, but I don't have to say much about them. Basically, it's like any other programming language, sort of, even though it's debatable whether CSS is a programming language, and I'm not getting into that. But you could basically save a bunch of stuff. The reason this is really nice is if I'm making a website for a company or an app for my company, most companies have brand colors, most websites have brand colors, so you can basically set them in one place at the start. And it means that A, you don't have to keep going and checking against your designs, like was that slightly different version of teal than I was using, or slightly different orange or whatever. And also then if you do change it, if something updates, you only have to change it in one place, because it's just set and that just spreads out everywhere. So it's just a really nice way to keep things really consistent and also let you change things easily and not have to Control F and go through 17 files trying to figure out where the last time you set that one font was. Okay, writing CSS. So these are just some like tips for writing CSS. I have mentioned BEM, which is a sort of naming convention that I am a fan of, but there are some others. But I mentioned it to make the point that make sure your class names make sense when you're writing CSS, because there's nothing worse than coming back and you're like, it totally made sense, but it was like, you know, BW-7x/15, because that doesn't mean anything. And then if someone's looking through your code, it's not obvious why it's named that class or why that links to the CSS that it is. If you can be more clear in your names, you can also be more specific, which, as I mentioned earlier, you know, sort of helps. It makes things apply a bit more logically. It makes sense as you look through it. There's also tools called SAS, LESS, things like that, which are just useful because they sort of, it's like a bit of an add-on to CSS, and it will compile down into CSS, but they give you things like nesting, some things basically that are functionality that CSS just doesn't quite have yet. Final tip, because I'm paranoid that I'm going way over my time, or I don't know if I'm alright or not. So my favourite thing, that I basically might as well have on every single tab, and I, if you know me, have a lot of tabs open in any browser at any time, is a website called Can I Use, and this is a small screenshot of it. But basically, like, all you need to do, if you're not sure if the thing that you want to do, like some of these things I've mentioned are really shiny and new, you just put it into caniuse.com and it will tell you which browsers at which versions support it or don't support it. A lot of the time, if you're building a website, especially for a company, you'll probably have a list of browsers that you do and don't have to support. There are ways to get around this. There's things called polyfills where you can, you know, add these in and it sort of compensates and builds out extra CSS to make a way around these. But you have to know that first, so you have to know what browsers do and don't support it. So it's just useful to jump on here, throw in whatever you want to use, and then you know. And you're not just having to go and hunt down like that version of the iPhone 5 that someone had, you know, in 3 departments somewhere to go, oh, I just need to test on your device because we've never seen it before, and actually it turns out it doesn't work. And it also gives, so there's some I deal with like caveats. I'm just gonna. My final tip is just please add, I swear, please add this to your CSS, because it just makes things a lot clearer. It changes how your children work inside the parent, and I am just saying it because it's left a bunch of confusion for me, and this has sort of tidied it up where things are sticking out when they don't need to be sticking out. It basically is the difference. If you add this, then the margins and padding and borders of, not the padding, but the margins and the borders of your device or your containers are considered. So it makes a difference between it's 100 with borders or it's 100 without borders. And yeah, so hopefully you've gone from the left, which is I have no idea what CSS is, to the right, which is I have some clue what I'm doing, and at least when I'm typing it with reason, and I actually have a plan for how to do the thing. Yeah. I don't know if I have time for questions, but
yeah, go for it. So what is the minimum browser you would recommend supporting in 2019?
I mean, like, ideally what I would like to say is evergreen browsers. So evergreen browsers, for those who don't know, is browsers where we're no longer going by like 10, 11, 12. Like Chrome and Firefox are evergreen. They have small incremental updates all the time. So those are probably, if you can get away with it based on your users and what, you know, the best thing really anyone should do is have analytics. Find out what your users are using. If you find out that 50% of them are on IE9, then you're probably going to have to support it even though you don't want to. But I would say the minimum that you should really be supporting is the evergreen browsers. And it's a lot easier because they tend to bring in new functionality a lot quicker and they tend to work together a lot more. But yeah.
Do you think developers are too reliant on frameworks for CSS?
I feel like you asked me that just because you know I have a rant in me about this. But yes, I think like there's code that I've seen in projects that I've worked on where people will go out of their way to add like 20 times as much memory and 20 times as much stuff that people have to pull down from a server to avoid writing CSS. And I know it's seen as this big scary world, but I think it's important to consider our users in that way, and it's important to think that if I can do it in CSS, why wouldn't I do it? I'm not bringing down a pile of stuff, I'm not requiring a whole bunch of memory and a whole bunch of calculations and stuff to happen. And also, my CSS is going to come down ideally before my JavaScript starts running, so it also gets me a lot of content into the page before I even get stuff. The worst thing is whenever you're relying on JavaScript for everything, and then your framework takes ages to come down, and your user's just looking at a white screen. So yeah, I would say, I think frameworks have their place and they can be useful, but if you can use CSS, use CSS. Does that make sense? No? Okay.